Grace Anderson hit the frozen ground before the stagecoach door fully opened. Her valise split on impact, scattering everything she owned across the snow-packed street of Hecla, Montana. She didn't stop to gather it. Across the road through the white wall of the blizzard, 4 men were dragging Owen Ellis, the man she'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry, out of the marshal's office in chains. A 5th man stood on the steps holding a lantern to a hand-lettered sign nailed to the door. It read, "Murderer." If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Grace's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every comment means the world to us, and we read every single one. The driver didn't wait. Grace heard the crack of his whip and the heavy roll of the stagecoach wheels pulling away behind her before she'd even gotten her footing on the ice. The cold hit her like a wall. Not the polite chill of a Boston November, but something with teeth, something that wanted to get inside her coat and stay there. She pulled her collar up with one hand and picked up what she could of her scattered belongings with the other stuffing stockings, and a folded letter, and a small leather-bound ledger back into the ruined valise, tying it shut with her belt because the latch was broken now, and there was nothing else to be done about it. She straightened. She looked across the street. The 4 men had Owen Ellis down the steps now. He wasn't fighting them, which surprised her. She'd expected a man who'd written letters the way Owen Ellis wrote letters to have more fire in him, more resistance. But he walked between them with his jaw set and his eyes forward, his wrists locked in iron cuffs that the blizzard had already dusted white. He was taller than she'd imagined. Leaner. His dark hair was pressed flat against his forehead from the snow, and there was a cut above his left eye, dry dark at the edges, fresh enough that it hadn't fully crusted over yet. He hadn't seen her. Nobody had seen her. The whole street was empty except for those 5 men and whatever terrible business they were conducting, and Grace Anderson stood in the middle of it with a broken valise and 2,000 miles of cold behind her, trying to decide what a sensible woman would do. A sensible woman would get back on the next stage. A sensible woman would not have come here in the first place. Grace had stopped being a sensible woman the morning she discovered that her employer of 6 years, Mr. Aldous Fitch, proprietor of Fitch & Associates Land and Title Services, Boston, Massachusetts, had been filing fraudulent deed transfers for 3 years, running skimming parcels of federally registered land out from under homesteaders who couldn't read well enough to know what they were signing. She'd been the one keeping his books. She'd been the one who found the discrepancy. A single column of numbers that didn't balance, buried in the April ledger. And when she'd pulled the thread, it had unraveled the whole thing. 17 fraudulent transfers, 11 falsified titles, and a name at the end of every transaction that wasn't Aldous Fitch at all, but a land acquisition company she'd never heard of, called Western Corridor Holdings. She'd made the mistake of confronting him about it on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, she'd been dismissed without reference, with the suggestion delivered calmly over the rim of a teacup that if she repeated a word of what she'd found to anyone with the authority to act on it, the documentation proving she'd been the one maintaining those fraudulent records would be delivered to the county court before she could open her mouth. Her name was on every ledger page, her handwriting, her figures. She'd spent 2 weeks in her boarding house room with the door locked thinking. Then she'd answered Owen Ellis's advertisement in the Boston Transcript. Not because she was romantic, not because she had any particular faith in the institution of marriage or the frontier life or men in general, but because Hecla, Montana was approximately as far from Aldous Fitch as a woman could get without leaving the continent, and because Owen Ellis's letter when she wrote to him and he wrote back had been the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. He'd written, "I am not a complicated man, but I am a steady one. I have a house and a job, and I am not in debt to anyone. I cannot promise you much, but I can promise you that." She had thought about that sentence for 3 days before writing back. Now, she watched 2 men she didn't know drag the man she'd come to marry around the side of a building and out of sight, and the man with the lantern nailed a second notice beside the first one. She was close enough, if she squinted through the blowing snow, to read it. By order of Hecla County, Land Authority, Owen Ellis Marshall is hereby suspended, pending investigation into the death of Jerome Aldgate, committed on the evening of November 14th. Grace stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up her valise and walked toward the man with the lantern. He was thick-shouldered, somewhere in his 40s, with a silver watch chain hanging from his vest pocket, and the kind of boots that cost more than most men in a mining town made in a month. He had a sheriff's deputy badge pinned to his lapel, but he wore it the way men wear something they've borrowed, like it didn't quite belong to him. "Excuse me," Grace said. He turned. Whatever he'd expected to find standing in the snow behind him, it wasn't her. His eyes went from her face to her broken valise to her face again. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, automatic and perfunctory. "I'm looking for Owen Ellis." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite alarm. Something more careful than that. "What's your business with the marshal?" "He's my intended," Grace said. "I've come from Boston to marry him. I believe there was an arrangement." The man with the lantern studied her for a long moment. Behind him, through the frosted window of what she now recognized as the marshal's office, she could see the orange glow of a fire and the shape of a man seated at a desk. "Name's Cal Briggs," the man said finally. "Deputy. Ellis is—" "There's been an incident, ma'am. He's not available." "I read the notice," Grace said. "Where have they taken him?" "He's being held at the county building on Sutter Street. But ma'am, I'd strongly advise you to—" "Which direction is Sutter Street?" Briggs opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at her broken valise again, and something crossed his face that might have been pity or might have been calculation. She couldn't tell yet. She'd only known him 30 seconds. "2 blocks east," he said. "But Mr. Voss won't see you tonight. Nobody's seeing Ellis tonight." "Who is Mr. Voss?" "Harlan Voss. He's the county land authority. He's the one he's handling the situation." "Thank you, Deputy," Grace said, and turned east. She heard Briggs say something behind her, but the wind took it. She kept walking. The county building was a 2-story structure with fresh paint that looked wrong against everything else on the block. Everything else was weathered gray or unpainted pine, the natural color of a town that had grown fast and without much planning. The county building had white trim on the windows and a brass plate beside the door that read, "Hecla County Land and Title Authority." Grace looked at that brass plate for a full 3 seconds before she pushed the door open. The warmth inside hit her like a fist. A clerk looked up from behind a long counter, young, maybe 20, with ink on his fingers, and the startled expression of a man who hadn't expected company. "Ma'am?" "I need to speak with Mr. Voss," Grace said. "Mr. Voss he's in a meeting, ma'am. He can't—" "Tell him Grace Anderson is here. I've come from Boston to marry Owen Ellis. And I'd like to know what charge has been filed against him and whether he's been allowed to speak to anyone in his defense." The clerk blinked. He glanced at a closed door at the far end of the room. "I'll just a moment, ma'am." He disappeared through the door. Grace set her broken valise on the floor beside the counter and pressed her cold hands flat against the wood and breathed. The ledger inside the valise was still dry. She'd managed to get it back in before the snow soaked through. That mattered. She wasn't entirely sure why it mattered yet, but she'd learned in 6 years of keeping Aldous Fitch's books that you never knew in advance which piece of paper was going to be the one that saved you. The door opened. The man who came through it was not what she'd expected, and she had to adjust quickly. She'd been preparing for bluster, for entitlement, for the kind of man who raised his voice when he wasn't immediately obeyed. Harlan Voss was quiet instead. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with a face arranged in a permanent expression of mild professional regret, as though he was sorry for everything, and sorry changed nothing. He wore a dark suit, and his boots, like Briggs's, were very good. "Miss Anderson," he said. "Mrs. Ellis shortly," Grace said. Something moved behind his eyes. "Ah, well, that may be premature given the circumstances." "What are the circumstances?" Voss folded his hands in front of him. Patient, practiced. "Jerome Aldgate was found dead yesterday evening. He was shot. He and Marshal Ellis had a dispute earlier that same day. Several witnesses observed it." "What was the dispute about?" "Land," Voss said. Aldgate held a deed to a parcel east of town. Ellis disputed its legitimacy. Grace looked at him. He looked back at her with his mild, regretful face. "Is there documentation?" she said. "For Aldgate's deed?" "Of course." "May I see it?" The mild expression flickered, just for a moment. "Miss Anderson, you've had a very long journey and it's late and—" "I've been a bookkeeper for 6 years," Grace said. "Land and title documentation. I'd like to see the deed." Voss was quiet for a moment that lasted 3 seconds longer than it should have. "That isn't possible tonight," he said. "The documents are in evidence." "Then I'll wait until they're available." Grace picked up her valise. "In the meantime, I'd like to see Marshal Ellis." "I'm afraid that's also not possible tonight." "Tomorrow, then." "Miss Anderson." Voss's voice was still pleasant, but something underneath it had hardened. "I would encourage you to consider your position carefully. You've arrived alone without family in an unfamiliar town in the middle of a significant snowstorm. The man you came to marry is under arrest for murder. A sensible woman would arrange passage home and put this whole unfortunate business behind her." Grace thought about Aldous Fitch saying something very similar over a teacup on a Wednesday morning in Boston. "I'll need a room for the night," she said. "Is there a boarding house in town?" Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Kane runs a respectable house on Maple Street. Briggs can show you." "Thank you," Grace said. She walked back out into the snow. Briggs was still outside the marshal's office, apparently having not found anything better to do in the past 10 minutes. He looked surprised to see her coming back his way. "She throw you out," he said. "He," Grace said. "And no. Will you take me to Mrs. Kane's boarding house?" Briggs fell into step beside her without argument. They walked 2 blocks in silence. The blizzard had settled into the kind of steady, determined snow that wasn't dramatic anymore, just relentless, the kind that didn't stop because nobody asked it to, and didn't particularly care what anyone thought about it. Grace tucked her chin into her collar and watched her footing. "How long have you been the deputy?" she said. 8 months. "And before Voss took over the land authority?" Briggs glanced at her sideways. "Who said Voss took over anything?" "He didn't grow up here," Grace said. "The office has fresh paint. The brass plate looks new. A man who's been in a position for years doesn't redecorate, so someone else held it before him." Briggs was quiet for half a block. "Fella named Duckett," he said finally. "Retired last spring. And Voss came in after." "About that, yeah." "And the deeds to the east parcels, the ones Owen was disputing, when were those filed?" Briggs stopped walking. Grace kept going 2 steps before she realized and turned back. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not quite fear, not quite respect, something between the two. "How do you know about the east parcels?" he said. "I don't," Grace said. "Not yet. But Voss mentioned a deed and a dispute and a dead man, and that's enough to know there's a land transaction in the middle of whatever happened to Owen. That's not complicated. It's just arithmetic." Briggs looked at her for another moment. Then he started walking again. "Deed was filed in September," he said quietly, not quite volunteering it. More like he couldn't hold it back. "Aldgate showed up in July with no money and no claim, and by September he had a registered deed to 400 acres east of town that sits right in the path of the railroad survey. The railroad is coming through here. That's what Voss says. And if it does, those 400 acres are worth 10 times what anybody paid for them. Aldgate couldn't have afforded 400 acres of Montana scrub 3 months ago, and now suddenly he's got prime corridor land and a registered deed." And Owen noticed. "Owen's been a Pinkerton detective," Briggs said, "before he came here and took the marshal job. He notices everything." They stopped in front of a house with a lamp in the window. "Mrs. Kane's boarding house," Grace could see the shape of someone moving behind the curtain. "Deputy," Grace said. "Briggs," he said. "Just Briggs." "Briggs, is Owen Ellis a man who would shoot someone?" Briggs looked at the lamp in the window for a moment. "No," he said. "He is not." "Then there are documents somewhere that say something different from what that deed says," Grace said. "And I need to see them." "Voss won't let you near them." "Voss doesn't know yet what I can do with a column of numbers," Grace said. She held out her hand. "Thank you for showing me the way." Briggs shook it automatically like he was still trying to catch up with the conversation. Grace picked up her valise and knocked on Mrs. Kane's door. The woman who answered was perhaps 65, sharp-eyed, with gray hair pinned severely back, and an apron that suggested she'd been in the middle of something when Grace knocked. She looked at Grace. She looked at the broken valise. She looked past Grace at Briggs standing in the snow, and whatever question she'd been forming changed to something else entirely. "You're the girl who came for Owen," she said. "Grace Anderson," Grace said. "Yes, ma'am." Martha Kane opened the door wider and stepped back. "Come in, then. Get out of that cold." She looked past Grace at Briggs again. "Cal Briggs, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, standing by while Voss does what he's doing." Briggs pulled his hat brim down and said nothing. He turned and walked back into the snow. Martha closed the door. The house was warm and smelled like coffee and something baking, and Grace felt her legs go soft for just a moment, the kind of thing that happened when a body had been braced against something for a long time, and suddenly the thing was temporarily removed. She stood very still in the entry hall and made herself breathe evenly. "You need to eat," Martha said, already moving toward the back of the house. "And you need to sleep, and in the morning you're going to need to be sharper than you've probably ever been in your life, because Harlan Voss is not a patient man, and he's not an honest one, and he did not get what he wanted from Owen Ellis, so now he's going to make sure Owen Ellis hangs." Grace followed her. "What did Voss want from Owen?" "Owen found the same thing you're going to find when you look at those deeds," Martha said without turning around. "He found that the land Aldgate was registered as owning doesn't match the survey records from when the territory was mapped. The numbers are wrong. Somebody changed them." Grace sat down at the kitchen table. "The original survey records," she said. "Where are they?" "Federal Land Office in Helena," Martha said. She set a mug of coffee in front of Grace. 3 days' ride. Owen sent a telegraph last week asking for a copy. Voss got to the telegraph operator before the reply came back." "What happened to the reply?" "It arrived," Martha said. "Nobody knows where it is now." Grace wrapped both hands around the mug and thought about the ledger in her valise. Thought about Aldous Fitch and his very careful books and the single column of April numbers that hadn't balanced. Thought about how a man who was smart enough to build a fraud was almost never smart enough to build a perfect one, because perfect frauds required perfect patience, and perfect patience required a certainty that nobody smart enough to catch you was ever going to look. "Mrs. Kane," she said. "Martha." "Martha." Owen sent a telegraph to Helena asking for the survey records. That means he knew what to look for in those records. That means he already had something. Something he found here in Hecla that told him the deed numbers were wrong. Martha was quiet. "Did Owen keep copies of anything?" Grace said. "Documents, notes, anything he'd collected before Voss had him arrested." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Her sharp eyes moved over Grace's face with the careful attention of a woman who had spent decades reading people and had learned to take her time. "He brought a box here," Martha said finally. 3 days ago. Said he needed someone to hold something safe. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone I trusted." "Where is the box?" Grace said. Martha Kane disappeared into the back room and came back with a wooden box roughly the size of a shoebox, plain pine, no lock. She set it on the table in front of Grace. Grace opened it. Inside 6 sheets of paper folded careful and flat. A small cloth pouch with what sounded like coins inside. A letter sealed addressed in Owen Ellis's handwriting to the Federal Land Commissioner, Helena, Montana. And at the bottom, tucked under everything else, a telegraph receipt with a date 3 days ago and a message that read, "Survey records. Hecla East Corridor parcels show discrepancy. Need confirmation. Please advise. Ellis." Grace unfolded the 6 sheets of paper. They were deed records. Or they were copies of deed records, the kind of copies a careful man made when he knew the originals might disappear. Owen Ellis's handwriting ran down the margin of each page in tight, precise annotation, noting discrepancies between registered parcel numbers and the boundary markers he'd apparently located himself on horseback. She read every word. She read them twice. The coffee went cold beside her. Martha sat at the other end of the table and said nothing and let her work. It took 45 minutes. When she looked up, she said, "He was right. The northeastern boundary on Aldgate's deed is off by 300 yards. If you use the actual survey markers, which Owen apparently walked himself, Aldgate's deed overlaps a parcel that was homesteaded 2 years ago by a family named Rouse. Legally, the Rouse parcel should take priority. But if the deed stands as filed Western Corridor Holdings..." She stopped. Martha looked at her. "What is it?" "Western Corridor Holdings," Grace said slowly. "That's the company listed as the parent entity on Aldgate's deed." "Voss's company," Martha said. "He thinks people here don't know it, but Owen found the registration paperwork." Grace set the papers down very carefully on the table. She had left Boston to get away from Aldous Fitch and Western Corridor Holdings. She had traveled 2,000 miles through November cold to marry a man she'd never met. And she had arrived to find the same company, the same fraud, the same falsified deed numbers, different territory, same hand, same scheme. Aldous Fitch was not just a Boston problem. He was a Western problem. He was a very large, very organized, very patient problem that had followed the railroad west and was buying land ahead of every survey in every territory it could reach using names like Aldgate and documents like the ones in Owen's box and men like Voss to make it stick. Owen Ellis had found the thread, and they had put him in chains before he could pull it. "Martha," Grace said, "I need a lamp and I need the rest of the night." Martha stood. She fetched the lamp from the windowsill and set it on the table between the papers and the coffee mug. "You know what you're looking at," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Grace said. "Then God help that man Voss," Martha said, "because he has no idea what just walked in off that stage." Grace spread the 6 sheets of paper across the table and reached for her ledger. Outside, the blizzard pushed against the windows with the steady, impersonal force of something that had no opinion about any of it. Inside, in the lamplight, Grace Anderson began to work the same way she had always worked, the same way she had worked every night for 6 years in Aldous Fitch's office, without knowing what she was building toward. Quietly. Precisely. One number at a time. Owen Ellis was not going to hang for a murder he didn't commit. Not if she had anything to say about it. And she had a great deal to say. She worked through the night. Not in the frantic, desperate way of someone racing against time, but in the steady, methodical way of someone who had learned long ago that panic was the enemy of accuracy. She laid the 6 sheets of paper out in order. She opened her ledger to a clean page. She began transferring Owen's margin notes into her own columns, cross-referencing the parcel numbers against each other, building a picture of what the deed actually said versus what the land survey markers Owen had walked said, which were 2 entirely different things. By the time the lamp began to gutter, she had filled 4 pages of her ledger with figures. By the time the first gray light came through the window, she had a discrepancy she could prove, not just identify, but prove with the kind of documented arithmetic that stood up in a courtroom because it didn't require anyone to trust her word. It required them to check the numbers themselves, and the numbers would say the same thing every time they checked. Aldgate's deed, as filed with the Hecla County Land Authority, described a parcel whose northeastern boundary ran along a ridgeline that didn't exist. Someone had taken the survey coordinates from a different parcel entirely. a parcel 12 miles south, and substituted them into the deed description, shifting the apparent location of the land by enough to place it squarely in the railroad corridor. The original parcel Aldgate had actually purchased based on the price recorded, and the legitimate acreage of land in that area was worth approximately $40. The parcel described in the filed deed was worth, by Grace's conservative estimate, based on the railroad acquisition prices Voss had apparently been advertising around town, somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000. The difference between $40 and $8,000 was a column of fraudulent survey coordinates and a land authority official willing to file them without question. She closed her ledger. She pressed her palms flat on the cover and sat in the early morning quiet of Martha Kane's kitchen and let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full weight of what she'd found. Then she stood up, folded Owen's papers back into careful order, and put the coffee on to reheat. Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:30, already dressed, taking in the papers spread on the table and the dark circles under Grace's eyes with a single comprehensive look. "You found it," Martha said. "I found enough," Grace said. "I need to get it to someone with the authority to act on it before Voss moves Owen to the county seat. If he gets Owen out of Hecla, the case goes to a judge Voss has already selected, and these documents won't matter." "How long do we have?" "Briggs told me last night that Voss wasn't seeing anyone, which means Voss spent last night preparing something. He moves fast." Martha poured herself coffee and stood at the counter and thought. Grace had already come to understand in the span of one night that Martha Kane's silences were not empty. They were the silences of a woman running calculations. "Judge Alderman," Martha said. "He's the territorial circuit judge. He's not Voss's man. He's been on the bench 22 years, and he doesn't owe anyone anything, and he knows this territory the way most men know their own kitchen." "Where is he?" "He keeps a room at the Hecla Hotel when he's in town. He rides circuits, so he's not always here. But Owen told me last week that Alderman was due through before the end of the month." Martha looked at the window. "If the snow stopped last night, he might have come in." "I need to see Owen first," Grace said. Martha looked at her steadily. "Voss said no." "Voss said no last night," Grace said. "This morning I have documentation of a fraudulent land deed that puts Voss at the center of a scheme that stretches from Boston to Montana territory. That changes the conversation." She gathered the papers. She put them in her ledger and put the ledger in her valise, which she'd tied shut again after the latch gave up entirely. She put on her coat. "The county building opens at 8, Martha said. "It's 6:30 now." "Good," Grace said. "I'll start with the jail." The snow had stopped. The town looked different without the blizzard, smaller. Quieter, the mountains visible now, at the edge of everything enormous and indifferent. Grace walked 3 blocks to what she'd been told was the jail. A low building behind the county structure, with a single deputy visible through the window, young enough that his beard was still working on itself. He looked up when she came through the door, and his hand went automatically to the edge of the desk. "Ma'am, this ain't visiting hours." "I'm aware," Grace said. "I need 2 minutes with Owen Ellis." "I can't allow—" "My name is Grace Anderson. I've traveled from Boston, Massachusetts, to marry Owen Ellis, and I have reason to believe that the man who arranged his arrest last night is engaged in a pattern of land fraud that I can document. I'm not asking you to release him. I'm asking you to let me speak to him for 2 minutes so that I can give him information that may be relevant to his defense." The deputy stared at her. "2 minutes," Grace said. "You can stand right there and listen to every word. I'm not smuggling anything in. You can search the valise." The deputy looked at the valise, then at her face, then at the valise again. He was perhaps 22 years old, and he had the expression of someone who had not yet figured out how to say no to people who were very certain about things. "2 minutes," he said, "and I'm right here." He led her through a door and down a short corridor, and she saw Owen Ellis before he saw her. He was sitting on the edge of a cot, with his forearms resting on his knees, looking at the floor. The cut above his eye had been cleaned. Someone had given him water and a cloth at some point, and he'd gotten his coat back, which meant he wasn't freezing, which was something. He was very still. Not the stillness of defeat. The stillness of a man who was thinking hard. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. She had thought in the back of her mind that seeing him for the first time would be awkward. That there would be a moment of adjustment, of recalibrating the letters she'd memorized against the actual face in front of her. She had not expected him to look exactly the way his letters sounded, but he did. Steady, direct, with something behind his eyes that was cautious and careful and not unkind. "Grace Anderson," he said. His voice was low, a little rough, with the particular flatness of a man who'd spent years listening more than talking. "Owen Ellis," she said. "I've come a long way to find you in a considerable amount of trouble." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something that would have been one under different circumstances. "I'm sorry about that. I didn't plan this particular welcome." "I know you didn't," Grace said. "I've been up all night with your documents." He went very still. "Martha gave you the box." "She did. I need to ask you something quickly because I only have 2 minutes. The deed Aldgate filed, did you find anything in the boundary descriptions that referenced the Harper Creek survey from 1871? Owen looked at her for a moment. "The northeastern coordinates," he said. "They match the Harper Creek markers." "Almost. They're transposed. Whoever modified the deed copied the coordinates but switched the northing and easting values. It's a small error. Easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for, but it means I can prove the modification was done by someone who understood survey notation but didn't understand it well enough to check their own work." Owen was silent. Then, "Voss brought in a land clerk from Billings 3 months ago. Man named Pearson, former surveyor. Pearson filed the deed. He processed it through the authority. Aldgate brought it in, Pearson accepted it. Does Pearson know what he filed?" "He knew something was wrong," Owen said. "I talked to him in October. He was scared. He wouldn't say much, but he wouldn't quite look me in the eye either, which is usually the same thing." "Time," the deputy said from the doorway. Grace looked at Owen. He looked back at her with those direct, careful eyes. "The letter in your box," she said quickly. "The one addressed to the land commissioner in Helena. Did you get a reply?" "It was intercepted," Owen said, "before it could reach me." "I know, Martha told me. But if you sent the letter, the commissioner's office has a record of it. And if they replied, there's a record of that too. Voss could intercept the copy that came here, but he can't intercept the copy that stayed in Helena." She picked up her valise. "I'm going to find Judge Alderman." Owen stood. He stood slowly with the particular care of a man who'd spent the night on a jail cot, and he was taller than she'd registered through the blizzard, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between relief and something more complicated than that. "Grace," he said. She stopped. "I'm sorry this is what you walked into." "Don't be," she said. "I've been looking for this particular problem for 3 months. I just didn't know it had a Montana branch." She glanced at the deputy. "Thank you." She found Judge Alderman at breakfast. He was in the dining room of the Hecla Hotel, a compact man in his late 60s, with white hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over enough human catastrophe to have stopped being surprised by any of it. He was eating eggs. He looked up when Grace stopped beside his table. "Judge Alderman," she said. "My name is Grace Anderson. I have documentation of a fraudulent land deed that I believe is directly related to the arrest of Marshal Owen Ellis last night, and I'd like to present it to you before Harlan Voss moves him to the county seat." Alderman looked at her. He looked at her valise. He looked back at his eggs. "Sit down, Miss Anderson," he said. "Mrs. Ellis shortly." "Sit down," he said, with the same inflection and a slight adjustment at the corner of his eyes that suggested he appreciated the correction. He gestured at the chair across from him. "You want coffee?" "Please." He signaled the waiter. Grace sat and opened her ledger on the table between the breakfast plates because there was no time for ceremony. She walked him through it in 15 minutes. The survey coordinates, the transposition error, the parent company, the pattern she'd seen in Boston with Aldous Fitch, which was the same pattern repeated here with different names on the same documents. Alderman asked 2 questions, one about the Harper Creek survey date, and one about whether she had Owen's original annotations or only her own transcription. She had both. She showed him Owen's handwriting in the margins of the copied deeds, and then showed him her own ledger pages, where she'd translated it into columnar form. When she finished, Alderman picked up her ledger and read through her columns in silence. He ate a piece of toast while he did it. He set the ledger down. "You were a bookkeeper," he said. 6 years. Land and title documentation. In Boston. For a firm called Fitch & Associates, which I now have very strong reason to believe is a subsidiary operation of the same entity that controls Harlan Voss and the Hecla County Land Authority. Alderman was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant allegation." "The documentation supports it," Grace said. "The company name on Aldgate's deed is Western Corridor Holdings. That same company name appears on 17 fraudulent deed transfers I discovered in Boston before I left. I don't have those documents with me. I didn't know to bring them, but I know where they are, and I know how to get them if I can communicate with the right people in Boston. And you believe Owen Ellis discovered the same fraud here?" "I believe Owen Ellis walked the survey markers himself and found they didn't match the deed. I believe he telegraphed Helena to confirm it. And I believe Voss had Jerome Aldgate killed and put Owen in chains for it, because Owen was the only person in this town with enough experience as a Pinkerton investigator to know what he was looking at." Alderman set down his coffee cup. "Voss plans to move him," Grace said. "If he gets Owen to the county seat before you can—" "I know what Voss plans," Alderman said quietly. He said it without particular heat, but there was something in his voice that had been absent a moment before a kind of gathering. "I've been watching Harlan Voss for 4 months, and I have had nothing I could act on. Nothing that would stand in front of another judge without looking like the word of a territorial circuit judge against a county land authority with friends in the territorial legislature." He looked at Grace's ledger. "You've given me something I can act on," he said. "Then act quickly," Grace said. "Please." Alderman was already standing. He left $2 on the table and picked up his coat from the back of the chair. He was a small man, but he moved like someone who had never in his life needed to fill up a room to command it. "Come with me," he said. They walked out of the hotel and directly to the county building. Alderman did not knock. He opened the door and walked through it, and the young clerk behind the counter came to his feet so fast his chair scraped back and hit the wall. "Judge Alderman, where is Voss?" "He's in his office, sir, but he's—" Alderman was already at the inner door. He opened it. Voss was at his desk. There was a man sitting across from him that Grace didn't recognize. Mid-40s road dusty, with the look of a man who'd ridden through the night to get somewhere. They both looked up. The stranger stood immediately. Voss rose more slowly with his practiced expression of mild regret arranging itself into place. "Judge Alderman," Voss said, "this is unexpected." "I'm issuing a hold on the transfer of Marshal Ellis to the county seat," Alderman said. "He stays in Hecla until I've reviewed the documentation related to the Aldgate deed." Voss was quiet for a moment. "That documentation is evidence in a murder investigation." "I'm aware of what it is," Alderman said. "I'm also aware that the survey coordinates in the filed deed contain a transposition error that calls the entire document into question. I'll be reviewing the original filing records today." He looked at the stranger. "Who are you?" The stranger glanced at Voss. Voss's mild face had gone carefully still. "Name's Pearson," the man said. "I'm a land clerk. I was just—" "You processed the Aldgate deed," Grace said. Pearson turned to look at her for the first time. Something happened in his face when he saw her, not recognition, but something like it. The look of a man who had been expecting to deal with a small problem and has just understood that the problem is considerably larger than he thought. "Miss," he started. "Mrs. Ellis," Grace said. She kept her voice level. She kept her eyes on his face. "You processed a deed with falsified survey coordinates. I can prove the coordinates were altered. The question I have for you, Mr. Pearson, is whether you altered them or whether someone gave them to you already altered and you filed them without checking." The room was very quiet. Voss said, "Pearson, don't say anything." Pearson looked at Voss. He looked at Judge Alderman. He looked at Grace, and whatever he saw in her face, whatever it was she'd inherited from 6 years of sitting across desks from men who were hiding things and learning to wait them out, seemed to make a decision for him that he hadn't been able to make on his own. "I didn't write those coordinates," Pearson said. "They came to me on the filing paperwork. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I knew something wasn't right, but Mr. Voss told me the parcel had been resurveyed and the original markers were in error. He said the new coordinates were the correct ones." "That's enough," Voss said sharply. "Mr. Pearson," Alderman said, "I'd like you to write down exactly what you just told me." Voss pushed back from his desk. "You have no authority to conduct an investigation in my office." "I have every authority," Alderman said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has not needed to raise his voice in 22 years because raising it was never what made him frightening. "And I suggest, Mr. Voss, that you sit down." Grace stood at the edge of the room with her valise in her hand and her ledger inside it, and watched Harlan Voss for the first time since she'd walked into that office the night before, look like a man who had run out of moves. It was not satisfaction exactly what she felt. Satisfaction was too simple a word for it. It was something more like the feeling at the end of a very long column of figures when the last number finally balanced, and you knew, not hoped, not guessed, but knew that the work was right. Owen Ellis was still in a jail cell. The case was not won. Voss was not finished. And whatever Aldous Fitch was running from Boston was larger than one deed in one Montana county. And there was still a dead man and a murder charge, and a trial that hadn't happened yet. None of that was resolved. But the ground had shifted. And Grace Anderson had been the one to shift it. Pearson wrote for 40 minutes. He wrote in the slow, careful hand of a man who understood that what he was putting on paper could not be taken back, and who had decided somewhere in the space between Voss's sharp command to stop talking and the quiet, absolute authority in Judge Alderman's voice that the time for taking things back had already passed. Alderman sat across from him at the small table in the corner of the Land Authority office and said nothing. He let Pearson write. Grace stood near the door with her valise and watched Voss. Voss had sat down when Alderman told him to. He sat with his hands folded on his desk, and his mild, regretful face arranged in perfect stillness, and he watched Pearson write with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. Not panicking. Calculating. Grace had seen that look before she'd seen it on Aldous Fitch's face on a Wednesday morning in Boston when she'd put the April ledger in front of him. The look of a man who is not yet beaten and knows it and is already working on the next move. That was the part that worried her. When Pearson finished, Alderman read the statement through, twice asked 2 clarifying questions about dates, and folded the papers into his coat pocket. Then he stood. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I am suspending your authority to transfer Marshall Ellis pending a full review of the Aldgate deed and all related filings. You will make the original documentation available to me by noon today." "And if I decline," Voss said pleasantly, "then I will telegraph the territorial governor this afternoon and explain why I have declined to decline," Alderman said. "And I will include in that telegraph a summary of the statement Mr. Pearson has just provided, along with documentation of survey coordinate discrepancies that suggest the filing was fraudulent." He picked up his hat. "I expect the documents by noon." He walked out. Grace followed him. Behind her, she heard Voss say nothing at all, which was somehow more alarming than if he had shouted. On the street, Alderman stopped and turned to her. "He's going to move the original documents," Grace said. "Yes," Alderman said. He'll alter them or destroy them. Possibly. Alderman looked at her steadily. Which is why I have no intention of waiting until noon. I'm going to the jail to release Ellis on my own recognizance. I want you to go back to Mrs. Kane's and stay there until I come for you. I'd rather... Mrs. Ellis, Alderman said with the particular finality of a man who had spent 22 years being listened to. Voss is cornered. A cornered man does things an uncornered man wouldn't. I need you somewhere I know you're safe because I need those ledger pages intact. They're the cleanest piece of evidence I have. Grace looked at him. You'll get Owen out. I will get Owen out, Alderman said. Go to Martha's. She went. Martha was at the kitchen table when Grace came in with a cup of tea and a look on her face that said she'd been listening for footsteps for the past 2 hours. Grace sat down and told her everything quickly and without embellishment, because Martha was not the kind of woman who needed things softened for her, and Grace was too tired to soften anything anyway. When Grace finished, Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Pearson signed it. He did. Lord. Martha got up and poured Grace a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, but needed badly. He's been carrying that for months. I could see it on him every time I passed him on the street. Some men aren't built to hold things like that. Do you know if Voss has anyone else in the Land Authority office? Anyone who might have access to the original filing records? There's a woman, Hattie Greer. She's been the records clerk there for 9 years through 2 different authority heads. She's not Voss's hire. Martha set the tea in front of Grace. She's a careful woman. She keeps copies. Grace looked up. Copies of the filed deeds. Hattie keeps copies of everything that passes through that office. She told me once that she'd seen too many papers disappear over the years, fires, floods, men cleaning out their desks in a hurry, and she decided after the 3rd time that she'd keep her own record. Martha sat back down. She keeps them at home. Grace wrapped both hands around the cup. If Voss destroys the original Aldgate filing, Hattie's copy would be the only record. If she has one. Would she give it to Alderman? If she understood what it was for? Martha looked at Grace. But somebody would have to explain it to her, and Hattie doesn't trust people quickly. She'd need to understand the whole of it. Can you take me to her? Martha was already standing. Hattie Greer lived 4 blocks from the Land Authority office in a house that was excessively tidy in the way of someone who had decided long ago that if she could not control the wider disorder of the world, she would at least control her immediate square footage. She opened the door before they knocked. She'd seen them coming up the walk and looked at Grace with the careful assessing eyes of a woman who had spent 9 years watching people bring paperwork to a government office and had developed strong opinions about what kind of people they were. Martha, she said. Then to Grace, you're the one who came in on the stage last night. Grace Anderson, Grace said. I need to ask you something, and I need to ask it quickly because I don't know how much time we have. Hattie looked at Martha. Martha nodded slightly. Hattie stepped back from the door. Inside, Grace explained it the same way she'd explained it to Alderman quickly, with the figures, with the survey coordinate transposition, with Pearson's statement, and Voss's reaction, and the noon deadline that Alderman had set, and that Voss was almost certainly not going to honor in good faith. Hattie listened without interrupting. She had the particular quality of stillness that came from years of professional record-keeping, the ability to receive information without reacting to it before it was complete. When Grace finished, Hattie said, "The Aldgate deed, filed September 4th. Yes." Hattie went to a cabinet in the back room. She came back with a cloth-covered ledger, the size of a church Bible, thick, heavy, worn at the corners from handling. She set it on the table and opened it to a page marked with a folded scrap of paper. "I copy every deed that comes through," she said. "Date, filing number, parcel description, boundary coordinates, all of it." She turned the ledger to face Grace. "September 4th. Grace leaned over it. There it was, Hattie's handwriting, small and precise, recording the exact coordinates from the Aldgate deed exactly as filed, including the transposed northing and easting values. including the boundary description that referenced a ridgeline 12 miles south of the actual parcel. "This is what was filed," Grace said. "That is exactly what was filed," Hattie said. "I recorded it the same day. September 4th, 3:17 in the afternoon. Would you testify to that in front of Judge Alderman?" "I've been waiting for 9 years," Hattie said, "for someone to ask me a question I had the right answer to." She closed the ledger. "I'll bring this myself." They were halfway back to Martha's when Grace heard boots behind her, quick, purposeful, more than one set, and turned to find Cal Briggs coming up the street toward her, with a look on his face that was somewhere between urgency and relief. "Ellis is out," Briggs said before she could speak. "Alderman released him 20 minutes ago. He's at Martha's." Grace did not run. She wanted to, but she walked quickly and kept her breathing even and told herself it was because she was tired and the footing was uneven, and not because she was afraid of what she'd find when she got there. She had spent the night building the case to free him. She had been working toward this since the moment she'd stepped off the stage and seen him in chains. The work was done, or the first part of it was done, and now there was just the rest of it. The trial that still hadn't happened. The murder charge that was still on record, the question of who had actually killed Jerome Aldgate, and how to prove it wasn't Owen. She pushed open Martha's door. Owen Ellis was at the kitchen table. He had a mug of coffee in front of him, and Martha was fussing at the stove, with the specific energy of a woman who needed to do something with her hands. The cut above Owen's eye was more visible in the daylight, clean now, but deep enough that it would scar. He was still in yesterday's clothes, and he needed sleep, and when he looked up at Grace coming through the door, the expression on his face was the same one she'd seen through the jail bars that morning. Careful, direct, with the complicated thing underneath it that was more than relief. He stood, old-fashioned, reflex automatic. "Sit down," Grace said. "You look terrible." He sat, and this time what crossed his face was definitely almost a smile. Grace sat across from him, set her valise on the floor, and looked at him properly for the first time, without bars between them, or Alderman beside her, or Voss in the background running his calculations. He was older than she'd expected from the letters, or maybe just more weathered, not old, but with the kind of face that had been through several different kinds of weather, and held the memory of them. There was gray at his temples that she hadn't noticed in the dark and the snow, and his hands around the coffee mug were rough-knuckled working hands. "Pearson signed a statement," Grace said. "Hattie Greer has a copy of the deed as originally filed. Alderman has your margin annotations and my ledger analysis. The foundation is there." "It's enough to challenge the deed," Owen said. "It's not enough to get the murder charge dropped." "I know." Grace looked at him. "Tell me about Aldgate." Owen set down his mug. He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, just precise. The way she'd come to understand was simply the way he organized things before he said them. "Jerome Aldgate was nobody's man," he said. "That was the first thing that struck me when he showed up in July. Voss had the land clerks, he had the deputies he'd put pressure on, he had the county commissioner in his pocket. But Aldgate was different. Aldgate came to me in September, 2 days after the deed was filed, and told me he thought he'd made a mistake." Grace went still. "He came to you?" "He was scared," Owen said. "He said he'd been approached by a man in Billings, a man he described as working for a land acquisition company, who told him he could have a registered deed to 400 acres if he signed some papers and kept his mouth shut. He said he signed the papers because he needed the money and the parcel sounded legitimate. He didn't understand what he was signing. But then the deed was filed, and he understood more. He heard people talking about the railroad corridor," Owen said. "He was not a sophisticated man, but he wasn't stupid. He figured out that whatever parcel he'd signed for was worth a great deal more than he'd been told, and that someone was using his name on a fraudulent document, and that if it went wrong, he'd be the one holding the bag. So he came to you." "He came to me, and I told him I was looking into it, and I told him not to speak to anyone else, especially not Voss. I told him I'd protect him." Owen's voice was flat on those last words. flat in the way that wasn't toneless but deliberately contained something. 3 days later, he was dead. Martha set a plate of biscuits on the table without saying anything and went back to the stove. It was the kind of thing a person did when a silence needed to breathe. "The night he was shot," Grace said carefully. "Where were you?" "At the office. Working late. I had no witness." He said it without self-pity, just as information. "Whoever planned this knew I had no alibi for that evening. That's not an accident." "They were watching you." "They'd been watching me for weeks. Since I walked the East parcel markers in October. Since I sent the telegraph to Helena." Owen looked at his hands. "I made a mistake. I moved too slowly. I thought I had more time to build the case before they moved on Aldgate. I was wrong." "Aldgate came to you in September," Grace said. "Did he give you anything documentation, anything he'd been given by the man in Billings?" Owen looked up. "He gave me a letter. The letter from the acquisition company, the one that offered him the arrangement. I have it. I had it. It was in the box I left with Martha." Grace pulled the box across the table. She opened it and went through the papers again, more carefully this time, unfolding each sheet and checking both sides. At the bottom, she found something she'd missed in the lamplight before dawn, a folded sheet tucked inside the cloth pouch, with the coins smaller than the deed copy's thinner paper. She unfolded it. It was a letter on company letterhead. The letterhead read, "Western Corridor Holdings Land Acquisition Division, Billings, Montana." The letter offered Jerome Aldgate the deed to a parcel described in general terms as east of Hecla, 400 acres, in exchange for his signature on a survey filing document, and his agreement to hold the deed passively for a period of no less than 6 months. It was signed not with a name, but with initials AF. Grace read those initials twice. Then she read the letterhead again. Aldous Fitch. She set the letter down on the table. "AF," she said. Owen looked at her. "You recognize the initials?" "Aldous Fitch," she said. "My former employer, Boston. He's the man who threatened me into leaving the man I discovered was running fraudulent deed transfers in Massachusetts." She looked at Owen. "I thought I was running from him. I didn't understand that I was running toward the same operation." The kitchen was very quiet. "He's the one running Western Corridor Holdings," Owen said. It wasn't a question. "I believe so. And this letter connects him directly to the Aldgate arrangement. If Fitch instructed the acquisition, then Voss is his man out here, not an independent operator, a branch office. This isn't one county in Montana. This is a coordinated land grab running along every planned railroad corridor in the territory." Owen was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It was not simple admiration, it was something more specific than that. The look of someone who has been working alone in a dark room for a long time, and has just found unexpectedly that someone else has been working on the other side of the same wall. "Grace," he said. She looked up from the letter. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I said that before through the bars. I mean it differently now. You came here to start something new, and instead you walked straight back into the thing you were trying to leave." Grace was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Briggs on the porch, the sound of a man who was near enough to be useful and far enough away to pretend he wasn't listening. "I've been thinking about that," she said honestly. "All night between the numbers, whether I was angry about it." She folded the Aldgate letter back along its original creases. "I'm not. I think I was always going to have to come back to this. I couldn't leave it in Boston without it following me. The only way out is through." Owen looked at her for a long moment. "The only way out is through," he repeated quietly, as though he was testing the weight of it. "Your letters sounded like a man who understood that," Grace said. "I wasn't wrong about that." Owen picked up his coffee mug. He looked at the table, the particular stillness of a man trying to decide how much to say. "No," he said finally. "You weren't wrong about that." "Good." Grace stood. She picked up the Aldgate letter and put it with the other papers in her ledger. Then let's talk about how we get a telegraph to Boston without Voss knowing, and who in the commissioner's office in Helena is trustworthy enough to receive what we're going to send them. Briggs appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had made a decision during whatever he'd been pretending not to overhear on the porch. "I know a man in the telegraph office," he said. "Night operator. He's not Voss's." Owen looked at him. Something passed between them, the look of two men rebalancing something that had been unbalanced. "Briggs," Owen said. "I should have come to you sooner," Briggs said. "When Voss first started moving on the east parcels, I knew something was wrong and I told myself it wasn't my business." He looked at Grace, then back at Owen. "It's my business now." Owen nodded once. It was not forgiveness exactly that would take longer, and Owen was not a man who did things quickly that deserved to be done carefully. But it was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of something. "Tonight," Grace said. "We send the telegraph tonight. The letter to the commissioner in Helena goes with everything Owen annotated, plus my ledger analysis, and the Aldgate letter with the initials." She looked at Owen. "If Fitch is reachable, if someone in Boston can serve him with a federal inquiry, his operation here collapses without its financial backing. Voss becomes a loose end with no one left to protect him." "And the murder charge," Owen said. "Aldgate was killed by someone who needed him silent before he could testify about the man from Billings who arranged the deed," Grace said. "That man from Billings is either Voss or someone Voss sent. Pearson's statement establishes Voss's direct involvement in the fraudulent filing. The letter establishes Fitch's connection to the original scheme. The motive is documented." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't kill Jerome Aldgate. You were the only person in this town trying to protect him." Owen was quiet. "Alderman will see that," Grace said, "when we give him all of it together." "You're very certain," Owen said. There was nothing challenging in it. It sounded, if anything, like something close to wonder. "Numbers don't lie," Grace said. "People do. But if you document enough of what people do, eventually, the numbers tell the story whether the people want them to or not." She picked up her valise. "I've been doing this for 6 years. I know when a case balances." She said it plainly without performance because it was simply the truth. And Owen Ellis looked at her the way a man looks at something he didn't know he needed until it was right in front of him, with the particular unguarded quality of someone who has stopped trying to maintain a careful expression and just lets his face do what it's going to do. Martha turned from the stove. She caught Grace's eye and said absolutely nothing, but the look on her face said more than words would have fit. Outside, the snow had melted from the boardwalks, and the mountains stood clear above the town in the cold morning air, enormous and patient, as though they'd been waiting all along for the weather to break. The telegraph went out at 11 that night. Briggs's man at the night desk was a thin, serious fellow named Amos, who asked no questions and took the folded papers Owen handed him with the practiced calm of someone who had learned that the less he knew about the content of messages, the better he slept. Owen dictated. Amos keyed. Grace stood near the door and listened to the rhythm of it, the dots and dashes carrying everything they'd built through the night and the morning out across the wire, into the dark-headed east toward Helena, and then further east still toward Boston, toward whatever federal ears could be found that hadn't yet been reached by Aldous Fitch's money. When it was done, Owen paid Amos, and the three of them walked back out into the cold without speaking. It was the particular silence of people who have done something that cannot be undone and are waiting to find out what it costs. Briggs peeled off at the corner of Maple Street. Owen and Grace walked the remaining block to Martha's without discussion because there was nowhere else to go and no particular reason to pretend otherwise. The house was dark except for the lamp Martha had left burning in the entry window, the kind of thing a person did for someone they expected back. The small, deliberate signal that said, "You are expected, you are not forgotten, come home." Owen held the door. Grace went through. They stood in the entry hall for a moment in the lamplight, and Grace was suddenly aware, in a way that the urgency of the previous 24 hours had not permitted, that she was exhausted in every layer. Bone-tired, mind-tired, the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from sustained, concentrated attention to things that matter enormously. "You should sleep," Owen said. "So should you." "I've slept in worse places than a jail cot." He looked at her. "You've been awake since the stage dropped you in a blizzard yesterday afternoon." "I'm aware of that." "Grace." He said her name the same way he'd said it through the bars that morning, not as a summons, but as a kind of acknowledgement, like saying it was a way of confirming she was real. "You've done more in 24 hours than most people manage in a month. The telegraph is sent. Alderman has what he needs. Hattie's ledger is in Alderman's possession. Whatever happens tomorrow happens whether you sleep or not." She looked at him for a moment. The lamplight did something particular to the angles of his face, softened. The weathered parts sharpened the careful eyes. She thought again about his letters, about the sentence she'd read 3 days straight before writing back. "I cannot promise you much, but I can promise you that." "I don't sleep easily in unfamiliar places," she said. "Neither do I." He reached up and took his hat off, a gesture so automatic and unconscious that she understood it was simply how he was when he wasn't performing anything. "I haven't slept easily anywhere in about 4 months, since I found the first discrepancy in the parcel records." "What did you do about it when you couldn't sleep?" He thought for a moment. "Rode out to the east parcels. Walked the markers again. Made sure I hadn't made an error." The corner of his mouth moved. "I hadn't, but it gave me something to do with the hours." "I did figures," Grace said. "When I couldn't sleep in Boston, after I found Fitch's discrepancy, I'd go over the numbers until they stopped feeling like evidence and started feeling like arithmetic again, something with a right answer." Owen looked at her with that unguarded expression, the one she'd first seen when she'd told him she could prove the coordinate transposition. "Did it work?" "Sometimes." She picked up her valise. "Go sleep, Owen. You look considerably worse than I do, and that's saying something." He almost smiled. It was close enough that she counted it. She was asleep within 5 minutes of lying down, which was not her usual way, and she didn't dream, which was a mercy. The response from Helena came at 7 the next morning. Briggs brought it himself, arriving at Martha's door before the coffee was properly done, with the telegraph slip in his hand, and an expression on his face that was straining hard against something that wanted to be excitement, and was held back only by the uncertainty of not yet knowing what it meant. Owen read it first, then passed it to Grace without speaking. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, with Martha looking over her shoulder. The Land Commissioner's office in Helena confirmed receipt of Owen's original telegraph from 3 weeks prior, and stated that a federal inquiry had been opened into the survey coordinates of the Eastern Corridor parcels in Hecla County. It confirmed that a copy of the original 1871 Harper Creek survey records had been dispatched to Judge Alderman's circuit address 7 days ago. It further stated that federal marshals were being dispatched from Helena to assist with the inquiry and would arrive in Hecla within 48 hours, weather permitting. And at the bottom, in the terse official language of a government communication that was doing its best to say something significant in as few words as possible, it stated that a parallel inquiry had been opened into the activities of Western Corridor Holdings in connection with multiple fraudulent deed filings across 4 territories, and that an individual identified as Aldous Fitch of Boston, Massachusetts, had been served with a federal summons the previous afternoon. Grace read that last part twice. Martha said, "Lord Almighty." "It's moving," Owen said. He was watching Grace's face. "That's the Boston end. If Fitch is served, the money stops. And if the money stops, Voss has no reason to protect himself anymore," Grace said. "A man like Voss has been protecting himself since before Fitch was in the picture. The question is whether he runs or whether he fights." She set the telegraph down. "Where is Voss right now?" Briggs said. "Still in the county building, far as I know. He sent a rider out last night. I saw it, but couldn't stop it without tipping him that I was watching. Rider went south. Toward Billings, Owen said. Probably. Briggs folded and unfolded the brim of his hat. Could be he's calling in more men. Could be he's sending word to whoever's above him that things are unraveling here. Fitch, Grace said. He'd send to Fitch. But Fitch is already served with a federal summons, so that line is compromised. She looked at Owen. Who else does Voss have locally? If he can't get support from Billings quickly enough, if the federal marshals arrive before he can consolidate, what does he have left in this county? Owen thought. The thinking was visible on him, not as uncertainty, but as the careful, methodical process of a man who had been trained to assess threats the way other men assessed weather. The county commissioner, he said. A man named Doyle. He's been in Voss's arrangement since at least January. He signed off on the land authority appointments that let Voss place his own people. Is Doyle the kind of man who runs, or the kind who negotiates? Negotiates, Owen said. He's a practical man. If he understands that the federal inquiry is already open and Fitch is already served, he'll look for the best arrangement available to him. Then he's actually useful, Grace said. Owen looked at her. If Doyle can be persuaded to provide a statement about Voss's operations within the county, she said, in exchange for consideration in the federal inquiry, that statement would include whatever he knows about the Aldgate arrangement, which likely includes who gave the order. Briggs said slowly, You want to flip Doyle before Voss does. Before Voss can get to him, Grace said. If Voss reaches Doyle first, and convinces him the best outcome is silence, Doyle stays quiet, and we lose that thread. But if Doyle understands that Voss is already isolated, that the money from Boston is cut off, and federal marshals are 2 days out, he's going to make the calculation that cooperation is worth more than loyalty to a man who can't protect him. She said it plainly without relish, because it wasn't satisfying. It was just the mechanics of how these things worked, the same way the mechanics of Fitch's fraud had been, not malicious, but just arithmetic columns that didn't balance transactions, that led somewhere they weren't supposed to. Owen stood. He put his hat on. I'll go see Doyle. I'll come with you, Grace said. He looked at her for a moment, not with the protectiveness of a man who doubted her, but with the particular look of someone who was still calibrating the new reality of not working alone. It was an adjustment. She could see it happening in real time. All right, he said. They walked to Doyle's office together, which was 2 streets over, in a building that also housed the county assessor and a land surveyor, and the general sense of bureaucratic permanence that county governments build around themselves like a shell. The secretary outside Doyle's door looked up at Owen with a flash of alarm. This was, after all, the man who'd been in chains 2 days ago, and then at Grace, whom she didn't recognize, and then at both of them together, and apparently decided that whatever was happening was above her authority to manage. He's in, she said. Owen opened the door without knocking. Douglas Doyle was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the kind of face that defaulted to friendliness, the way certain landscapes default to flat. It was the path of least resistance, and you had to look carefully to see the calculations running underneath it. He stood up when Owen came in. He was already reaching for a handshake before he'd registered who it was, and then he registered it, and the handshake turned into a frozen gesture that he had to actively choose to either complete or withdraw. He completed it. That told Grace something. Marshal, he said carefully. Doyle. Owen sat without being invited. Grace sat beside him. You've heard about the federal inquiry into the Eastern Corridor parcels. Doyle's careful smile adjusted itself by a few degrees. I've heard some things. Aldous Fitch was served with a federal summons yesterday afternoon, Grace said. Federal marshals are arriving from Helena in 48 hours. The Land Commissioner's office has confirmed that the 1871 Harper Creek survey records are already in Judge Alderman's possession, which means the coordinate discrepancy in the Aldgate deed can be established without requiring anyone's testimony. Doyle looked at her. And you are Grace Anderson, she said. I was a bookkeeper for Fitch and Associates in Boston for 6 years. I have personal knowledge of the Boston end of this operation and documented evidence of the connection between Fitch's Eastern operations and Western Corridor Holdings activities in this territory. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. The fraud case is established with or without your cooperation, Mr. Doyle. What is not yet established is who gave the order that resulted in Jerome Aldgate's death. Doyle was very still. That, Grace said, is the piece that determines whether this ends as a land fraud case or a murder case. And that distinction matters considerably for everyone who was adjacent to the arrangement, including people who may not have known the full scope of what they were signing off on. Owen said nothing. He sat with his forearms on his knees and watched Doyle and let Grace work. And there was something in his stillness that was not passive. It was the active stillness of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had chosen deliberately to make space for it. Doyle looked from Grace to Owen and back to Grace. His friendly face had dropped the performance entirely now. What was underneath it was not villainous, it was just tired. The face of a man who had made a series of small accommodations over a long period of time and had not allowed himself to add them up until someone put the total in front of him. I didn't know about Aldgate, Doyle said. I want that on record. I knew about the deed arrangements. I knew they weren't clean. But I was told Voss told me that Aldgate was a willing participant and that the whole thing would be dissolved quietly once the railroad rights of way were secured. And you believed that, Owen said. His voice was flat, not accusatory, just noting. I wanted to believe it, Doyle said, which was a different thing, and the fact that he said so suggested he was, as Owen had predicted, a practical man who had decided which way the wind was blowing. Did Voss tell you Aldgate was a problem? Grace said. Doyle's jaw worked for a moment. He said Aldgate was getting nervous, that Aldgate had gone to the marshal. He glanced at Owen. He said the situation needed to be resolved before the deed could be challenged. Resolved, Owen said. That was the word he used. Doyle looked at his desk. I didn't ask what he meant by it. I should have asked. Yes, Owen said. You should have. The room was quiet for a moment. I'll give a statement, Doyle said. To Alderman, whatever he needs about the county commission's role in appointing Voss and in approving the filing procedures that allowed the deed to go through without independent verification. He looked up. I won't be able to testify to Aldgate's killing directly. I genuinely don't know who pulled the trigger. But I can testify that Voss expressed the intent to resolve the problem Aldgate represented, and that this occurred 2 days before Aldgate was found dead. That's enough, Grace said. That establishes motive and connects Voss to the circumstance. Combined with what Pearson has already said. Pearson gave a statement. Doyle's voice was quiet. Yesterday morning, Owen said. Doyle absorbed that. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man watching the last possible argument for a different choice dissolve. I'll go to Alderman today, he said. They were outside and 3 blocks away before Owen spoke. You handled that well, he said. He'd already decided, Grace said. Before we walked in, I just gave him the language for the decision he'd already made. Most people wouldn't have seen that. Most people don't spend 6 years watching men decide things in offices, she said. You learn to read the room before you open your mouth. She glanced at him. You gave me room to work. You didn't try to take it over. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't need me to. No, she said. But some men would have anyway. He looked straight ahead. I was a Pinkerton for 11 years, he said. I worked with a woman investigator for 3 of them. She was better at the room than I was. I learned early that the smartest thing you can do in a situation like that is get out of the way and let the right person do the work. Grace looked at him. What happened to her, the investigator? Retired, he said. Married a cattleman in Wyoming. Last I heard, she was running his books, and had turned his operation from a loss into a profit in 18 months. The corner of his mouth moved. She was a bookkeeper before she was a detective. Grace considered that. "Is that why you advertised for a bookkeeper?" she said. "In the letter. You said you needed someone who could help with the ranch accounts." "The ranch accounts genuinely needed help," he said. "But yes, I had some sense of what that kind of mind was worth." He paused. "I didn't anticipate the specific application." "No," she said. "I don't imagine you did." They walked for half a block in a silence that was different from the silences of the previous 2 days, less pressurized, less driven by immediate urgency. It was the kind of silence that had room in it for other things. "Owen," Grace said. "Yeah. When this is settled, when Alderman has everything and the marshals arrive and the charge is formally dropped, what happens to the marshal's job?" He considered that. "Voss suspended me. Alderman reinstated me provisionally when he released me. Whether the county commission confirms it depends on who's sitting on that commission once Doyle is done cooperating with the federal inquiry. And if they don't confirm it, then I'm a former marshal with a ranch and an innocent verdict and no particular plan." He glanced at her. "Is that a problem?" "No," Grace said honestly. "I didn't come here for the marshal's salary." She looked at the street ahead. "I came here for the man who wrote, 'I cannot promise you much, but I can promise you that.'" Owen stopped walking. She went 2 steps further and turned back the same way she'd turned back when Briggs stopped on the street 2 nights ago. But this time she wasn't returning to manage a conversation. She was just looking at him. He stood in the cold morning with his hat pushed back slightly and his careful eyes doing that unguarded thing they did when he stopped managing his expression, and she understood that this man, this particular specific infuriating, steady, decent man, was going to take a long time to know. That the letters had been a beginning, and the past 2 days had been a beginning, and everything that had actually started between them was still only beginning. She found to her own mild surprise that she was all right with that. More than all right. "Grace," he said. "We should get back to Martha's," she said. "Alderman will want to know about Doyle." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he settled his hat and started walking and fell into step beside her, and the distance between them on the boardwalk was smaller than it had been 2 days ago, without either of them having made a decision about it. Behind them, the door of the county commissioner's office opened, and Douglas Doyle walked out into the cold morning with his coat buttoned and his face composed with the particular resolution of a man who has stopped running from something and turned around to face it. He turned in the direction of Judge Alderman's hotel and did not look back. The net was drawing in. Not quickly, these things never moved quickly, and Grace had learned too well what happened when people moved faster than their evidence could support. But steadily, the way a column of numbers resolved itself line by line toward a sum that had always been there waiting. The federal marshals arrived in 41 hours, not 48. There were 3 of them riding hard from Helena, with the kind of purposeful quiet that distinguished men who had done this before from men who only thought they had. Their leader was a marshal named Carver, compact, gray-bearded with the economy of movement of someone who had learned long ago that the appearance of urgency was less useful than the fact of it. He went directly to Judge Alderman upon arrival and spent 2 hours behind a closed door. When he came out, he had Alderman's full summary. Pearson's signed statement. Doyle's testimony. Hattie Greer's copied ledger. Owen's annotated deed records and Grace's columnar analysis, all organized in the order Grace had arranged them the previous evening. Because she'd understood without being asked that a federal marshal receiving a complex case needed the documentation sequenced the way a closing argument was sequenced from the most verifiable fact to the most interpretive conclusion, with nothing left to chance or assumed knowledge. Carver had looked at the organized stack and then looked at Owen and said, "This your work?" "Mostly hers," Owen had said with a slight tilt of his head toward Grace. Carver had looked at Grace for a moment with the assessing eyes of a man who evaluated people the way he evaluated evidence quickly, accurately, without sentimentality. "You have a formal background in land documentation." 6 years, Grace said. "Fitch and Associates, Boston." Something crossed Carver's face. "Fitch," he said. "You worked for Fitch." "Until he threatened me into leaving, yes." Carver looked at the stack of documentation again. "We've been building a case against Fitch for 14 months, he said. "His Boston operation has been the hard part. He keeps his books clean on the surface." He looked up. "Do you have personal knowledge of the Boston records?" "I kept them," Grace said. "I know where every discrepancy is and what it connects to. I can reconstruct 6 years of fraudulent transactions from memory if you give me a ledger and enough time." Carver was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Ma'am, I think the federal government owes you a considerable debt." That had been yesterday. Now it was morning, 2 days after the marshals arrived, 3 days after Doyle's statement, 5 days since Grace had stepped off the stage into the blizzard, and Harlan Voss was in custody. He had not run. That had surprised almost everyone except Grace, who had watched him in that office and seen the calculations behind his mild face, and understood that Voss was the kind of man who believed right up until the moment the door closed that there was still a move available to him. He'd spent 48 hours after Doyle's statement trying to find it. He'd sent 2 more riders out. Briggs had tracked where they went and reported back to Carver, which had the effect of intercepting whatever communications Voss was attempting before they could reach anyone who might help him. He'd attempted to access the original Aldgate filing and found Alderman had placed it under federal seal. He'd sent for a lawyer from Billings who arrived, reviewed the evidence summary Carver provided, and quietly advised his client that cooperation was likely the only remaining variable that meaningfully affected his outcome. Voss had listened to that advice for approximately 4 hours, and then requested to speak with Carver directly. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Grace was not in the room for it. Owen was not in the room for it. They sat in Martha's kitchen and drank coffee and did not discuss what was happening because there was nothing left to do about it, and both of them had learned in their different ways that there was a particular discipline required in the moments when you had done everything you could do and the outcome was in other hands. Martha made biscuits. She made them the way people cooked when they needed their hands occupied with extra attention to the details, pressing and folding and pressing again. The kitchen smelled like flour and butter and the wood smoke from the stove, and outside the window the mountains stood in the late autumn light with their particular enormous patience. Briggs came in at 10:30. "Voss gave them the shooter," he said without preamble. Owen set down his coffee. Grace looked up from the ledger she'd been using to organize her notes for Carver's Boston inquiry. "Who?" Owen said. "Man named Ruel. He was brought in from Billings in October, same time as Pearson, different purpose. He's been staying at the boarding house on 4th Street under a false name." Voss gave Carver the room number, the real name, and the specific instruction he'd received from Voss to resolve the Aldgate situation. Briggs looked at Owen. He also confirmed that the instruction came down from Fitch originally, through a wire from Boston 3 days before Aldgate was killed. Carver has the wire record. Owen was quiet for a moment. "It's done then," he said, not as a question, as a man who needed to hear it said plainly in order to fully believe it. "Ruel's in custody," Briggs said. "Voss is giving his full cooperation in exchange for consideration on the murder charge. He didn't pull the trigger, and he's arguing he didn't know Fitch's instruction would be carried out the way it was. Whether that holds is for the court to sort out." He paused. "The murder charge against you is formally dropped. Alderman signed the papers an hour ago." The kitchen was very still. Martha made a sound that was not quite words, and set down her biscuit dough and pressed both floury hands flat on the counter and looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a woman emptying out something she'd been holding for a long time. Owen looked at his hands. He sat with that for a moment, in the way he sat with everything, with the full weight of it, not rushing past it toward whatever came next. Grace watched him, and did not say anything, because this was his moment to take the time it required, and she had learned in 5 days what she suspected she would keep learning for years, that Owen Ellis was a man who needed to be allowed to feel things at their actual size, and that allowing him that was not passive, but was its own kind of care. Then he looked up, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful steadiness, not the unguarded flicker. Something quieter and more fundamental than either. The look of a man who has been braced against something for so long that when it finally releases, the absence of it feels stranger than the weight did. "Grace," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded once slowly and picked up his coffee. Carver came to Martha's that afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and walked them through what the next several months would require: the federal proceedings against Fitch in Boston, for which Grace's testimony and documentation would be essential; the territorial proceedings against Voss and Ruel, which aldermen would oversee; the review and likely invalidation of all Eastern Corridor deed filings made under Voss's authority, which would require a proper surveyor and a land clerk to process. He looked at Grace when he said that last part. The Federal Land Office would pay a consultant's rate, he said, for someone with documented expertise in fraudulent deed identification, who was willing to work through the backlog of Eastern Corridor filings and flag anything that showed the same pattern as the Aldgate deed. Grace looked at him. "How large is the backlog?" "Potentially 4 territories," Carver said. "Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, Dakota. If Fitch's operation was as systematic as you suggest, and from what I've seen it was, there are likely dozens of similar filings. Possibly more." "That's a year's work," Grace said. "At least," Carver said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not suggesting it lightly." She looked at Owen. Owen looked back at her with the particular expression of a man who was specifically not influencing a decision in either direction, who had made the conscious choice to hold himself neutral and let her find her own answer. "The ranch accounts," she said to him. "Can wait," he said, "or can be handled evenings. They're not complicated. I overestimated the problem when I put it in the advertisement." "You put it in the advertisement to make yourself sound practical." "I am practical." "I know," she said. "That's not a criticism." She looked at Carver. "I'll need to be based in Hecla. I won't travel between territories for extended periods." "Understood," Carver said. "The fieldwork can be done by correspondence, and the documentation can be sent to you here." "Then yes," Grace said. "I'll do it." Carver reached across the table and shook her hand with the businesslike certainty of a man who had gotten what he came for. He stood, put his hat on, and said to Owen, "You're a lucky man, Marshal." "I'm aware of that," Owen said. There was nothing performative in it. He said it the way he said things that he simply knew to be true. Carver left. Martha appeared from the back of the house with an expression that suggested she'd been listening from the hallway and had no apology to make about it. "Well," she said, "that's settled then." "Not all of it," Grace said. Martha looked at her, then at Owen, then back at Grace with the look of a woman who understood perfectly well what remained unsettled and was deciding whether to say so. She decided not to. She went back to the kitchen. Owen stood. He took his hat from the hook by the door and held it for a moment, which was the thing he did when he was thinking about how to start something. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the east end of town, where the buildings thinned and the street became a road, and the road became a track, and the track led out toward the flat frozen ground of the eastern parcels, the land that had started all of it, the 400 acres that had cost Jerome Aldgate his life, and Owen his freedom, and Grace her last remaining illusion that she had left her trouble behind in Boston. The mountains were very close out here, or seemed so the way they always seemed closer when you stopped being inside something and came out into the open. Owen stopped where the track ended at a fence line. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the land. "I walked these markers 7 times, he said, "before I was sure enough to send the telegraph." 7, Grace said. "I needed to be certain. I needed it to not be me making an error." He looked at the fence post in front of him. I've been wrong before. About cases, about people. Not often, but enough to know that certainty is not the same as accuracy, and that the feeling of being sure is not evidence. What made you send the telegraph on the 7th time? I found the Harper Creek coordinates, he said, in Aldgate's deed. Matched them against my survey notes from the actual parcel. 12 miles off. He glanced at her. There's no innocent explanation for a 12-mile coordinate shift. I'd been looking for an innocent explanation through 6 walks. The 7th one I stopped looking. Grace looked at the fence post beside him. You stopped looking and sent for confirmation. Yeah? That's exactly right, she said. That's exactly how it should be done. He looked at her. The late afternoon light was coming in low and flat from the west, the kind of light that didn't flatter anything, but showed everything clearly. And Owen Ellis in that light looked like what he was, a careful, tired, decent man, who had been doing the right thing in difficult circumstances for a long time, without particular acknowledgement, and without particularly requiring any. I need to say something to you, he said. All right. When I placed that advertisement, he said slowly, I told myself it was practical, that I needed someone to run the books, and that a wife made sense for a man of my age with a ranch and a steady position. I told myself it was arithmetic. He looked at the mountains. It wasn't arithmetic. Grace waited. I'd been alone for a long time, he said. Not unhappily. I'm not a man who needs a great deal of company. But there's something that goes missing over enough time. Something you stop noticing is missing because you get used to the shape of the absence. He turned to look at her directly. I was lonely, and I wrote letters to 32 women over 8 months, and yours was the only one I wanted to keep writing. Grace held his gaze. Why? She said. Not a challenge, genuine inquiry. Because you asked the right questions, he said. Every other letter asked about the house or the income or what kind of man I was in the general sense. You asked what I thought was the hardest part of the work. You asked whether I'd ever been wrong about a person and what it had cost me. You asked, he paused. You asked whether I believed that people were mostly to do the right thing, or whether I'd seen too much to believe that anymore. Grace remembered writing that question. She'd sat with it for a long time before sending it. It had felt presumptuous too much to ask of a stranger. She'd almost taken it out of the letter. What did you answer? She said, though she knew. She'd read the letter so many times she could have recited it. I said I believed people were mostly trying, he said, even the ones who'd gone wrong somewhere, that the trying was usually genuine even when the outcome wasn't. He looked at her steadily. I still believe that. I believed it even when Voss was putting me in chains. I believed Doyle was trying in his limited way. I believed Pearson was trying. And Aldgate, Grace said quietly. Aldgate was trying, Owen said. He made a bad choice out of desperation, and then he tried to fix it. It cost him everything, and he tried anyway. He was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing. That counts. Grace felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not the way things shifted in the stories she'd occasionally read in her boarding house in Boston, the ones with the dramatic declarations and the sweeping gestures. It was quieter than that. The shift of a load that had been carried one way for a long time, settling into a different and more manageable distribution. Owen, she said. Yeah. We were supposed to be married 3 days ago. He looked at her for a moment. I was in jail 3 days ago. I know. She looked at the fence post between them. I'm pointing out that the original arrangement stands as far as I'm concerned. If it still stands on your side. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up to check his expression. What she found on his face was not hesitation. It was the thing she'd come to recognize as his version of gathering himself, the visible process of a man who did not say things he didn't mean, and therefore took a moment before saying things he did. Grace Anderson, he said. I have been waiting for you since long before you stepped off that stage. I didn't know I was waiting, but I was. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat, Not tipping it, just a small self-conscious gesture, the kind that happened when a man's hands needed something to do because the rest of him was occupied with something that mattered. If you'll still have me in spite of what you walked into, I would consider myself the most fortunate man in Montana territory. In spite of what I walked into, Grace said, is the wrong way to say it. He looked at her. Because of what I walked into, she said. That's why I'll have you. Not in spite of it. A man in comfortable circumstances who has never been tested is a theory. You're not a theory. Owen Ellis looked at her with his unguarded face and his careful eyes and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing to add to it, and he was wise enough to know that. They were married 4 days later in the small church on the hill above Hecla on a clear December morning with the snow crusted bright on the mountains and the sky the particular hard blue of winter at altitude. Martha Kane sat in the front pew and cried without apology. Briggs stood in the back with his hat in his hands and managed to look both uncomfortable and pleased simultaneously. Hattie Greer came and brought her ledger, because she was the kind of woman who didn't go anywhere without documentation, and Judge Alderman performed the ceremony with the unhurried gravity of a man who had seen enough broken things to understand the value of something solid being made. Owen said his vows in the flat, quiet voice that carried everything underneath it without announcement. Grace said hers with the same precision she brought to columns of figures clearly without flourish. Meaning every word, because she had chosen every word and would not say something she did not intend to keep. When it was done, and Alderman pronounced them married, and Owen turned to her with that almost smile that had been becoming more fully a smile over the past week, Grace thought about the valise she'd hit the frozen ground with on the night she arrived, about the ledger that had stayed dry, about the 6 sheets of paper in the wooden box, and the letter with the initials AF, and the column of numbers in Aldgate's deed that didn't balance, and all the long chain of small, precise things that had led her here, not by accident, not by luck, but by the accumulated weight of work done carefully and honestly in the direction of what was right. She thought about Owen's advertisement in the Boston Transcript, which she'd almost passed over because the wording was too plain, too unadorned, too lacking in the romantic language that such advertisements usually contained. She'd almost turned the page. She was very glad she hadn't turned the page. Outside the church in the hard December light, Hecla went about its morning, miners and merchants and women carrying parcels, and children running on the boardwalks and the mountains standing enormous behind everything, indifferent to all of it, and somehow, in their indifference, a kind of comfort. The town did not stop for a wedding. It had its own momentum, its own weight, its own troubles and recoveries, and ongoing arithmetic of survival. But inside that small church, in the moment before the doors opened, and the cold came in, and the world resumed, Owen Ellis took Grace's hand with the same care he did everything steadily, without performance, with the full intention of not letting go. And Grace Anderson, who was Grace Ellis, now held on. Some women crossed a continent looking for safety. Some crossed it looking for escape. Grace had crossed it looking without quite knowing it for a problem large enough to be worth solving, and a man honest enough to be worth knowing. And she had found both in the same blizzard, in the same broken-down town, on the same frozen street where she'd hit the ground running, and hadn't stopped since. She had come 2,000 miles into the cold. What she had found there was the kind of warmth that doesn't announce itself, that builds slowly through shared work and mutual honesty, and the particular intimacy of two people who have seen each other at their most necessary, and decided that what they saw was enough. More than enough. The beginning of something they would spend years learning the full dimensions of and never regret starting. That was not luck. That was not accident. That was the only outcome available to a woman who refused to look away from what the numbers said, who kept her ledger dry through a blizzard, and who understood finally completely in the clear, cold light of a December morning in Montana that the only way out had always been through.